Welcome to Discovering God's Word, chapter by chapter. Hi, I am Elliot Hamm, the minister at the Willette Church of Christ in Red Boiling Springs, Tennessee. I will be your host for this podcast. Thank you for joining me for our study of God's Word. Life can be challenging, but there is incredible strength and guidance and comfort to be found in the pages of the Bible. I am so glad you have joined me this week as we study Matthew chapter 23. This chapter stands as one of the most direct and forceful rebukes that Jesus delivers in the gospel accounts. We find that Jesus has turned his attention squarely on the religious establishment of his day, the scribes and Pharisees, exposing their profound hypocrisy and detrimental impact of their leadership. Rather than a private critique, this is a public denouncement, spoken directly to the crowds and his disciples. Jesus instructs his followers to respect the authority these leaders hold due to their position, but passionately warns against imitating their actions and attitudes. He meticulously dissects their motivations, highlighting their love of public acclaim, their insistence of titles, and the stark contrast between their spoken teachings and their self-serving behaviors. The heart of the chapter consists of 7 powerful woes that Jesus pronounces upon these leaders, each one a specific indictment of their spiritual failings. He condemns their obstruction of the kingdom, their superficial holiness masking inner corruption, their neglect of weightier matters of the law, and their persecution of God's messengers. Ultimately, Matthew 23 serves as a potent warning against religious hypocrisy and the dangers of leading others astray through inauthentic faith. It underscores the importance of integrity, genuine obedience, and a heart that truly reflects God's justice, mercy, and faithfulness. The chapter concludes with Jesus' emotional lament over Jerusalem, foreshadowing its coming judgment for rejecting the Messiah. Let's take a closer look at our text. The first 12 verses we see the denunciation of the scribes and Pharisees. In verses 1 through 4, Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do not according to their works, for they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. Despite their inability to answer Jesus, the Pharisees remained opposed to him. Their opposition continued. They were joined by the scribes, who were scholars of the law that was respected by the Jewish people. Jesus acknowledged the scribes and the Pharisees' scholarship as occupying Moses' seat there in verse 2. This is indicative of their accurate interpretation of Moses' writings, though not equal in authority. So in verse 3, Jesus instructed his disciples to obey their teachings when he says, Whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. However, Jesus knew that neither the scribes nor the Pharisees lived by the law they correctly taught. In verses 5 through 12, Jesus continues, But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But you do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Instead of glorifying God through their religious practice, these hypocritical Jewish leaders sought human praise. To gain attention, they brazenly enlarged their phylacteries. Phylacteries were Jewish scriptures written on parchment or vellum, and vellum is a prepared animal skin or a membrane used as a writing material. These phylacteries were fastened in plain view to the foreheads and the borders of their garments. They craved honored seating and public accolades, like being called rabbi, which was a title reserved for scriptural law experts, the same as being called a doctor in religious context today. Jesus taught against seeking such titles, emphasizing that Christ is our only master and we are all brethren. Seeking religious titles like master or father is the same as seeking divine honor. Instead, true greatness lies in service, as he explained in verse 11. And then in verse 12, Jesus will explain that self-exaltation leads to humbling, while humility leads to exaltation. Correct teaching isn't enough. God's approval requires living out his word. In verses 13 through 36, we see the woes against the scribes and the Pharisees. Before we get into these woes, be aware of what woe means. It means a solemn denunciation of punishment. In verse 13, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in." The first woe was condemning them for their hypocrisy. Jesus charged the scribes and the Pharisees with discouraging others who were at least trying from entering the kingdom of heaven, though they themselves refused to go in. They were trying to keep souls from hearing and accepting the message. They should have been among the first to accept the truth Jesus provided and thus lead many others in obedience. In verse 14, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation." Here's the second woe. Their lengthy, self-righteous prayers were meaningless when compared with their exploitation of the poor and the burdened. This hypocrisy would lead to a more severe judgment than if they had never offered such prayers. Verse 15 says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves." The third woe. They pretended to be so religious, going to great lengths to win others to their Jewish denomination. But once a person accepted their religious persuasion, no matter how sincere the person might be, the scribes and Pharisees tried turning them into a more hypocritical fanatic than they themselves were. In verses 16 through 22, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, Whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind! For which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind! For which is greater, the gift of the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore he who swears by the altar swears by it and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it." The fourth woe. With this one, which is aimed against the enemies of the truth, Jesus called them both fools and blind, making distinctions where there was no difference. As for swearing oaths, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 verses 34 through 37 had taught his disciples not to swear. The emphasis was on truthfulness and faithfulness. Vows to God should be kept. Truthfulness in all things are expected. What he's getting at here, making arbitrary oaths, is the crux of the matter. In verses 23 and 24, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel." The fifth woe here. Jesus rebuked the scribes and Pharisees for their distorted priorities, meticulously attending to minor details while overlooking the weightier aspects of law. His point was not to disregard the smaller matters, but to ensure these small matters did not overshadow the larger ones. He presented life not as either or choice, but as an and both responsibility, addressing both the significant and the seemingly insignificant. In verses 25 and 26, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and the dish, that the outside of them may be clean also. The sixth woe. Jesus rebuked the scribes and Pharisees for their focus on external religiousness that concealed inner corruption. He argued that their primary need was to purify their inner being so that their true selves would match their outward religious facade. The dish here symbolically represents the heart of the Pharisee. When the heart is clean, then the outside, those outward actions, are clean also. In verses 27 and 28, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so you outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. The seventh woe. Jesus changed the illustration from cup and dish to whitewashed tombs. However, just as in the previous woe, the object of his condemnation was their inward corruption. In verses 29 through 36, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we have lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Therefore, you are witnesses against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up, then, the measure of your father's guilt. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous bloodshed on the earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Here, the eighth and final woe. Jesus will target the scribes and Pharisees' hypocrisy in claiming to be more righteous than their ancestors who murdered the prophets. Their outward respect for the prophets denied an inner alignment with their persecutors. This same dynamic can unfortunately be seen in the church today. Jesus' authority and expertise as the master teacher is on display in this chapter. In verses 37 through 39, we see Jesus weeping over Jerusalem. In verse 37, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who were sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Extraordinary in its sorrows, this lament, this weeping, reveals Jesus' heart. Even as the established false teachers of his day fought against his teachings and his authority, seeing Jesus as an enemy, his mission was one of goodwill, not destruction. Their great loss was their refusal to heed his pleadings, for in doing so they would have received comfort, protection, and the gift of salvation. Verses 38 and 39. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Their resistance to the truth and the genuine life Jesus offered meant Jewish religious forfeited his blessings. Even as he stood in the shadow of the cross, their impending crucifixion of him would ironically pave the way for even their worst enemies to find salvation through his bloodshed. Soon after his resurrection, many involved in his death would seek his blessings. We see this in Acts chapter 2. Here are a few lessons that we have learned from Matthew 23. A huge lesson learned here is about hypocrisy. It is a grave spiritual danger. Jesus repeated these woes, which highlights the destructiveness of saying one thing and doing another, especially in religious leadership. Outward religious observance without inward transformation is meaningless. The Pharisees meticulously followed external rules, but they neglected justice, mercy, and faith. They were seeking human praise, human titles, which can corrupt motives. Jesus warns against craving the recognition, the honors, emphasizing that true greatness lies in service. Another lesson learned, in addition to hypocrisy, is about leadership. True spiritual leaders should be servants, not self-exalters. Jesus emphasizes humility and service as a key characteristic of those who lead in God's kingdom. Next is a lesson on living. We should not create unnecessary burdens for others in the name of religion. The Pharisees imposed heavy rules that they themselves did not follow. We can learn of focusing on minor details while neglecting major principles can lead to spiritual blindness. Jesus condemned their meticulous tithing of spices while ignoring justice, mercy, and faithfulness. We learn on living with inner purity, which Jesus said is more important than the outward appearance. Jesus stressed the need to cleanse the inside of the cup and the dish first. We need to learn and to be aware of self-deception regarding our own righteousness. The Pharisees falsely believed that they were better than their ancestors. Another lesson we learn is of Jesus' feelings, of his thoughts. He's teaching about rejecting truth and genuine living, which leads to loss of blessings. The Jewish leaders' resistance ultimately led to his weeping and judgment. God's desire is for people to turn to him for comfort, for protection, and for salvation, even those who oppose him. Jesus' weeping over Jerusalem reveals his compassionate heart. For you this week, would you consider these questions? First, a question of self-examination. In what subtle ways might you be prioritizing outward appearances of righteousness over genuine inner transformation? This will get to the heart of the authenticity of your faith. And also, are there any areas in your life where you might be blind to your own hypocrisy, perhaps criticizing others for things that you do yourself? Next is a question on the treatment of others. Are you ever guilty of laying heavy burdens on others? Spiritual burdens, emotional burdens, or practical burdens that you are unwilling or unable to bear yourself? This prompts some reflection on your interactions and your expectations of others. Next is a question on your beliefs and your behaviors. Do you ever find yourself hindering others from a deeper relationship with God because of your own rigid interpretations or your own judgmental attitudes? This question will challenge you to consider the impact of your beliefs and your behaviors on other people's spiritual walk. Lastly, a question about inner purity. In what ways might you be more concerned with cleaning the outside of the cup, the outward actions, while neglecting the inside, or your inner thoughts and your inner desires? This can help put into proper perspective the importance of inner purity. Friends, thank you so much for listening this week. I pray that you will join me again next week as together we discover God's Word chapter by chapter. Have a great week.